Welcome to episode 131 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurian philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with our panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the ancient Epicurean text, and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself. We suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in this study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. Today we continue with Epicurus' letter to Pythocles, and we look at the implications of the Epicurean position on certain weather phenomena. Now let's join Joshua reading today's text.
Signs of the weather may occur owing to the coincidence of occasions, as happens with animals we can all see on Earth, and also through alterations and changes in the atmosphere. For both these are in accordance with phenomena, but under what circumstances the cause is produced by this or that, we cannot perceive. Clouds may be produced and formed both by the condensation of the atmosphere, owing to the compression by winds and by the interlacing of atoms, clinging to one another and suitable for producing this result, and again by the gathering of streams from earth and the waters. And there are several other ways in which the formation of such things may not be impossibly brought about. And from them again rain may be produced, if they are squeezed in one part or changed in another, or again by a downward current of wind moving through the atmosphere from appropriate places, a more violent shower being produced from certain conglomerations of atoms suited to create such downfalls. Thunder may be produced by the rushing about of wind in the hollows of the clouds, as happens in vessels on earth, or by the reverberation of fire filled with winds inside them, or by the rending and tearing of clouds, or by the friction and bursting of clouds when they have been congealed into a form like ice. Phenomena demand that we should say that this department of celestial events, just like them all, may be caused in several ways. And lightnings, too, are produced in several ways. For both owing to the friction and collision of clouds, a conformation of atoms which produces fire slips out and gives birth to lightning. And owing to wind bodies which give rise to this flash are dashed from the clouds, or compression may be the cause. When clouds are squeezed, either by one another or by the wind, or again it may be that the light scattered abroad from the heavenly bodies is taken in by the clouds, and then is driven together by the movement of the clouds and wind, and falls out through the cloud. Or else light, composed of most subtle particles, may filter through the clouds, whereby the clouds may be set on fire by the flame, and thunder produced by the movement of the fire. Or the wind may be fired owing to the strain of motion and its violent rotation, or clouds may be rent by wind and atoms fall out which produce fire and cause the appearance of lightning. And several other methods may easily be observed, if one clings always to phenomena, and can compare what is akin to these things. Lightning precedes thunder in such a conformation of the clouds, either because at the moment when the wind dashes in, the formation of atoms which gives rise to lightning is driven out, but afterwards the wind whirls about and produces the reverberation, or because they both dash out at the same moment, but lightning moves at a higher speed towards us, and thunder comes after, as in the case of some things seen at a distance and producing blows. Thunderbolts may occur because there are frequent gatherings of wind, which whirls about and is fanned into a fierce flame, and then a portion of it breaks off and rushes violently on the places beneath, the breaking taking place because the regions approached are successively denser, owing to the condensation of clouds, or as the result of the actual outburst of the whirling fire, in the same way that thunder may be produced when the fire becomes too great and is too violently fanned by wind, and so breaks through the cloud because it cannot retreat to the next regions owing to the constant condensation of clouds one on the other. And thunderbolts may be produced in other ways too. Only superstition must be excluded, as it will, if one successfully follows the lead of seen phenomena, to gain indications about the invisible. Cyclones may be produced either by the driving down of a cloud into the regions below in the form of a pillar, because it is pushed by the wind gathered inside it and is driven on by the violence of the wind, while at the same time the wind outside impels it sideways, or by wind forming into circular motion, while mist is simultaneously thrust down from above, or when a great rush of wind takes place and cannot pass through sideways, owing to the surrounding condensation of the atmosphere. And when the spout is let down onto the land, whirlwinds are produced in all the various ways in which their creation may occur, owing to the movement of the wind. But if it reaches the sea, it produces waterspouts.
Okay, Joshua, thank you for reading that for us today. This is all follow-up from episode 130, the one we did last week, in which we spent much more time on some of the rules of epistemology. We were discussing, I remember one of the anecdotes you brought up last week, Joshua, was the Christopher Hitchens statement, was to the effect that it was not so important what they thought, but how they thought. And we got a lot of good epistemology in the discussion last week. This one has a little bit of it. I see at least 2 instances in it. But this week, and it looks to me like next week, will be relatively straightforward observations about weather and other things that are going on around us. And so we're going to have probably a little more opportunity to sort of freelance in our discussion, because we'll be able to bounce off the specifics that he says, of course, which are historically interesting, as well as discuss the asides or the explanations he gives about continuing to use the method of multiple explanations that are possible and not selecting a single cause when multiple ones are possible. But at any rate, as we go through today and next week as well, it'll be a particularly opportune moment for any good stories or any other tangents that anybody wants to take as we go through this. We're beginning today on line 99, at least of the Bailey version, and the first thing that comes to his attention is actually the first words are signs of the weather. So it's almost as if he's talking about the potential of predicting the weather, which I guess people have always been able to observe to some degree, that there are natural, I guess, I don't know if you can really sense declining, what is it, not air pressure, but is it air pressure? Joshua, what am I talking, or Martin, what's the classic up and down? Martin, I've got one of these German-looking houses in my kitchen. It's got a guy with an umbrella on one side and a woman with a flower thing on the other, and they move in and out depending on, I guess it's atmospheric pressure, which can predict a front moving through.
Yeah, which you would measure with a barometer.
Barometer, yeah. I don't know if they could have observed atmospheric pressure changes in the ancient world or not.
Certainly, he talks a lot here about the condensation of the atmosphere, which is hugely important for quite a lot of weather phenomena. It's particularly important, I would say, in an agrarian society and also in a seafaring society. And Greece, to some extent, was both of those. I grew up in Iowa in the Midwest in the United States, and it seems like every farmhouse I've ever been to, and also in the homes of everyone who grew up on a farm, you'll see a barometer hanging on the wall, which most people, I guess, who live in the city don't have a barometer hanging on their wall. But it's particularly important for people who are trying to do things out of doors and who are trying to eke a living off of things that are out of doors.
I guess you can sometimes see animals maybe do something that might predict that maybe there's about to be a storm. So he's making an observation that there are certain things that do tend to run on in advance of changes in the weather. And so it's interesting to think about how those would occur and make sure that we don't have to attribute those to supernatural influences.
It certainly is the case that animals will respond to the weather typically before people will. And I've just observed this a number of times in my own life. I have relatives who keep goats, and I remember one time my grandpa was standing outside and suddenly all the goats go running off in the same direction to get under the shelter of the shed. And he's standing there looking at the goats thinking, what are you doing? And then, 10 or 15 seconds later, the sky opens up and he gets drenched, but the goats are dry because they seem to know it was coming. And even things like ants will typically cover their burrows when there's weather coming in. They think there's rain coming in. I say they think there's rain coming in. Of course, it's all just instinctual at that level. But so there certainly is something going on with animals before this happens. And I think you'd have to be, Epicurus said he preferred the countryside, I think, to the city. And it's by being in the countryside and making these observations that you begin to see stuff like this.
And his conclusion on that paragraph about the animals, but under what circumstances the cause is produced by this or that, we cannot perceive. So I guess he's sort of making the observation there that we cannot perceive that. He's not even really suggesting an answer there as far as how animals can predict it. He said, I guess this maybe this is an example of what you do when you wait for additional information. If you don't have any good observation or speculation as to how the animals are doing it, then you just don't jump to the conclusion that some spirit is whispering in their ear. And then he moves on to talk about clouds and how they are formed and the production of rain and thunder and lightning. I don't want to go too fast here, but
before we started the recording, we were talking about how weather is the thing that you talk about when you don't have anything else to talk about. It's sort of the classic small talk issue. So in the hope that we don't run out of things to talk about, one thing I'd like to talk about here a little bit is the hymn to Venus at the very opening of Book 1 of Lucretius. This is the very beginning of the poem. Many people think it's one of the best parts of the poem. I certainly have a great fondness for the hymn to Venus myself. And one of the challenges that the hymn to Venus presents to the reader is the challenge that apparently one of the scribes who was copying this poem highlighted, because he put in the margin, this is just what I hear from academics, he copied into the margin a later quote from Lucretius saying that the gods don't create the universe and that they don't cause any effect on Earth. It doesn't happen like that. It's a challenge because, of course, in the hymn to Venus, you see a whole bunch of things that are attributed to the goddess Venus, and quite a lot of them have to do with what we're talking about today, which is meteorology. Beneath the gliding stars, make us to teem the many voyaged main and fruitful lands. All things are conceived through you, and visit the great sun as they open their eyes for the first time. Before you, goddess, the stormy wind and massy cloud flee away. The earth bears flowers, and for thee the waters of the unvexed deep smile, and the hollows of the serene sky glow with diffused radiance for thee. This is not my favorite translation. This is, I think, William Ellery Leonard. But it goes on and on like that. For as soon as comes the springtime face of day, and the procreant gales blow from the west unbarred, the fowls of the air are smit to the heart by thee. And then it goes on to talk about animals that are bounding over the happy main and daring to swim through bounding torrents. And it just goes on, and there's all kinds of meteorological and astronomical observations that are made in this poem, particularly in the hymn to Venus. And people who read Lucretius for the first time, and maybe without knowing a whole lot about Epicurean philosophy, might be forgiven for coming away from this and thinking, this is not at all what people have described this poem to me as. This poem is supposed to be a didactic poem that attempts to explain and teach the method of Epicurus, and particularly his materialism and his rejection of any intervention by the gods. And yet it opens up with this passage in which apparently Venus is just doing everything. But of course it isn't Venus. And as you read the rest of the poem, you're supposed to get to know that Venus is a stand-in for Lucretius in a number of ways. She's a very complex figure in the poem, but what she really stands in for is, as he says here, let me try to find it, procreant gales blow from the west unbarred. And So this idea is not that you've got some goddess sitting up on Mount Olympus that's waving her wand and making all of this happen. It doesn't happen like that. What it actually is, according to Epicurus, is just the ceaseless and random movement of atoms through the void that are coming together, and they're just giving rise to all of this, to all of the phenomena that we see. And so while we're looking at the weather and the formation of clouds and tornadoes and thunder and lightning, everything that he's talking about here in the letter to Pythocles, what we're invited to do by Epicurus, and even more so by Lucretius, is to look through the phenomena and to see the principles that are at work on the other side of it. And that's what's going on throughout this whole section on meteorology, is that while we don't always know the answer to be able to explain why the animals can perceive weather phenomena before it happens, we don't always have the answer for what causes lightning or thunder. We are led to believe, at least by Epicurus, that he did have the answer, what you were talking about in the last episode, Cassius, which is the higher level conclusion that this is all happening in a material universe and that it doesn't need any influence from the outside. You know, the weather really is one of the attributes of the gods that is, I think, probably almost the oldest attribute of the gods. We don't think of Yahweh as being, the God of Christianity, as being particularly a weather god. But of course, Zeus was a god, predominantly he was the god of thunder and lightning. And so for Epicurus to come onto the stage now in ancient Greece, when the central figure of the Greek pantheon has a quiver full of lightning bolts that were forged for him by Hephaestus, to come onto the stage now and saying, in fact, that those lightning bolts were not forged by Hephaestus. They were forged by nature herself out of the material of nature, which is atoms and void.
Joshua, I would say that what you've just brought up is a really good thing for us to talk about for a while here. In referring to Lucretius and the opening section on Venus, as with a lot of aspects of Epicurean philosophy, there's sort of disagreement and differences of opinion about some of the subtleties of what's being said. And I think I've seen people will maintain that some will maintain that Venus represents nature. Others will represent that she represents pleasure in that context. And that, for example, dear Venus, mother of the Roman line, the pleasure involved in procreation. A lot of what you cited in that opening section is the drive to continue with the races of animals and men. So there's sort of a duality of role here that, of course, we don't consider pleasure to be supernatural or non-natural. There's no contradiction between Venus being both the goddess of pleasure and being totally natural. The subtlety that people talk about as much as anything else seems like to be this issue of whether Venus is acting with intent towards creation and leading it in a particular direction as if she were some supernatural god. But even Lucretius himself makes clear, call upon, carries, if you like. It's okay to talk in those kind of terms as long as you don't give in to the temptation of what amounts to supernatural religion, of a capricious, active, intelligent God who is steering things for their own purposes. This opening of Venus in Lucretius doesn't really have Venus selecting. It does say mother of the Roman line. Maybe that's just some sugar for Memmius, who is the intended recipient, as well as other Romans, to get them to identify with all this. But nevertheless, all through this, nature is, like you said, it's one of the oldest questions people have. Is there some intent behind the weather? Do thunderstorms and lightning indicate that the gods are displeased? Does drought indicate that the gods are displeased, that we need to go out and sacrifice some more cows or sacrifice some more people to make the gods happy again, that we've failed to follow their rules in some way? I mean, that kind of thing is so much at the heart of, even today, that's the first thing so many people think about whenever something goes wrong is, what did I do to displease the gods that they would send this earthquake or this tornado to me to punish me for all of this? And so it's certainly not, maybe just of historical interest to talk about these particular ways of describing how the weather happens. But it continues, I would suggest, to be tremendously important to people today to get comfortable with the idea that what they do or don't do is not driving how much rain they're going to get this week, or how cold it's going to be, or how hot it's going to be. Now we could start talking about climate change issues and other things like that that might get us too close into politics for comfort, really. But even in those circumstances where people pollute the world, where the negative consequences of that are not brought upon them by supernatural gods. They're brought upon them by natural reaction of nature to what they've done to it. So it's the point of this letter to make sure that Pythocles understands the particular points about weather issues, which do concern a lot of people. And of course, the celestial, the moon, the sun, the other things that we've already discussed.
So what's, I think, really interesting about this, of course, Lucretius, like any ancient writer, you're writing an epic poem, essentially. There's a number of figures that he had in mind as predecessors. He was thinking of Roman Ennius, who came before him. He was thinking of the Greek Empedocles. But above all, you have to be thinking about Homer. And what really drives this issue home, and Lucretius makes the point himself, is that sort of the Genesis narrative for Greek culture and Greek civilization is this Trojan War described in the Iliad. And the Iliad itself begins, as Greek epics do, in media res, which means in the middle of things. But there's a story to be told before that, and later Greek playwrights like Euripides told that story, and it has to do with how the Greeks got to Troy, because they had offended Poseidon. And if you're trying to get, what's the classical figure, 10,000 ships? Is this the face that launched 10,000 ships? I think is a famous line in English verse. If you're trying to get 10,000 ships from Greece to the coast of Asia Minor, and you've just pissed off Poseidon, who is the god of the sea, now you've got a real problem on your hands. So the solution to that problem, quite tragically, was the decision made by Agamemnon to, in some versions of the story, to summon his wife and his daughter Iphigenia, or as I think Lucretius refers to her as, now I'm not going to be able to pronounce it, Iphigenia or something like that. So she's summoned to a wedding, which is supposed to be the marriage of Iphigenia, in some cases to Achilles. So that's the pretext by which Agamemnon summons his family. And then when she gets there and she's dressed up for the bridal ceremony, she's actually led to the altar by her father and sacrificed to placate the gods by her own father. Lucretius thought that this was the seminal problem with religion, that the structure of religion, while it puts on this face of peace and of virtue and of sort of saving you from hell and saving you from the problems that, frankly, religion itself imposes, the deep underlying architecture of religion is actually pain and fear and suffering. And it is expressed by Lucretius that it was particularly the murder of a child by their parent as a sacrifice to the gods that was the hallmark figure. And it starts at the very beginning of the Greek story. And it was because of issues like the ones we're talking about. They didn't understand that weather was just a material, natural phenomena, that the gods played no part in it. So if you've got stormy seas, then the thing to do probably is just to wait and maybe wage your war next year or something. But they thought that if they sacrificed Agamemnon's daughter, and in some versions of the story, actually the Greek army is clamoring for her sacrifice to placate the god, because they themselves don't want to die. So this is really the nature of the problem. When you begin from false assumptions, as we've been repeatedly saying over the last few episodes, the conclusion that you come to, or the result that you come to, is often not just wrong, but horribly wrong. And that seems certainly to have been the case for the approach to meteorology and the signs, as it says here in Lucretius, the gliding signs of heaven. That seems to have been the result of many early attempts by people to try and understand these things. And if you try to think about it a little harder, and you start, as Epicurus starts, with method, and you rule out what he calls a different method, the method of the single cause, you need to accept that there might be multiple causes, or that there are competing explanations, each of which might serve as the cause, or they might not, but you just don't know the answer. And if you don't know the answer, it's probably too early to start sacrificing your daughter to placate the gods. It's
Yeah.
I don't know how to state it more clearly than that.
Well, we can put a period to it anyway by saying it the way that Epicurus says it here, because after he goes over in these lines we've been looking at through 102 and 103, 102 about the wind and rain and lightning and thunderbolts, he says in 104, and thunderbolts may be produced in other ways too, only superstition must be excluded, as it will if one successfully follows the lead of seen phenomena to gain indications about the invisible. So before we move to the next section of different phenomena that he's talking about, he does include one of his epistemology observations here, which we probably would do well to talk about for a few minutes. Obviously, only superstition must be excluded is something that he's been hammering throughout all of his work. But not because there's evidence of it that he wants to hide. It's because there is no evidence of it. And he wants you to follow the lead of seen phenomena, meaning evidence that is in front of you, to gain indications about the invisible being, I guess, what you don't have direct evidence of. I mean, this structure here is pretty much an echo of numerous locations where he's already said in different ways that you must use the evidence that you do have to form your theories about things that you don't have evidence for. You don't just start making up answers without evidence. You analogize from the things that you do have evidence of and use those to reach your, again, you can call them conclusions, theories, whatever you want to call them, your opinions about the things that you are left to just simply speculate about. Speculation should be, I don't know whether speculation is a word that always implies lack of evidence or not, but the point is that your opinions about things of which you're not certain still need to be based as much as possible on evidence that you are confident.
Well, the question I pose to you and Martin is, suppose somebody said to you, Cassius, I came to Epicurean philosophy because I wanted answers. And if all you're going to tell me repeatedly throughout this entire letter is that you don't know anything, then why should I bother listening to you? It sounds like I should just go listen to Pyrrho, the skeptic, who claims that nothing is knowable. That seems to be an attractive alternative to me, because you told me that you had answers, but now I come to you and it turns out you don't seem to know anything at all.
That's a great way to frame the question. And what's the response to that? I would say, first of all, to this person who says something like that, you're not really paying attention to what Epicurus is saying. Because, yes, he's telling you that there are things that he does not know the answer to, but he's also telling you things that he does know the answer to. He's being very clear, especially when you get into Lucretius, I think it's book 4, that knowledge about certain things is possible, that it is possible about things that you see directly in front of you that you can get good evidence on to reach sound conclusions that you can have confidence in. You may get carried away in your details, and some of those details might eventually be proven wrong, but certain basics of life, things that are right in front of you, are repeatable, and you observe them over and over and over again to the point where you do observe things that do not seem to have any exceptions whatsoever. And you don't always have to get to that point to have confidence in your conclusions, but there are many things in life that you do have conclusions that you can have confidence in. And that's one of the big differences between Epicurus and Pyrrho or any of the more extreme skeptics, because they did, in fact, take the position that all knowledge is impossible, almost in a sort of Socratic way as well, that Socrates was doing the same thing in a lot of the way he presented things. But Pyrrho is the classic example of somebody who took the position that all knowledge is impossible. Anybody who really wants to get into that topic definitely needs to go into, again, I think it's Lucretius book 4, where he says he's not even going to argue with the man who says that all knowledge is impossible, because such a man, his own argument refutes himself. How does he know what's right and wrong if he has no confidence in anything at all? And Lucretius stresses in that section how important it is to rely on the senses to form the basis of your rationality and of your opinions. If you don't rely on the senses, you're going to be dead in short order. And really, people, even those who, like Pyrrho, want to be argumentative about it, all of us know that we rely on our senses to get up in the morning, go to bed at night, drive our cars, do everything that maintains our lives. And we have confidence in the repeatability of many opinions that we have reached about things. And all Epicurus is really saying is that you need to understand the difference between those things that you can have confidence in and those things you can't have confidence in. If you don't have enough information to have any opinion at all, you wait and don't have an opinion. If you have some information, but not enough information to eliminate every possibility, if you come up with 4 or 5 or more possibilities, then you hold those possibilities as possibilities. You don't select one, fall in love with it, get enamored of it, I think is a word we used last week, and say, well, this is my pet theory. It's the only one that could possibly be true. The sun must be rotating around the earth because it's driven by a chariot of horses by some god or something. You can't get enamored of a pet theory that does not have enough evidence to really convince you of its certainty. So Epicurus is showing you the intelligent, prudent way between radical skepticism of Pyrrho and those who say that all knowledge is impossible, and the absolutely supernatural, ridiculous, religious or other methods of saying that I know the absolute truth of the universe. He's saying that not everything can be known with certainty, but a lot of things can, and the prudent person is going to intelligently look at all the evidence and follow the evidence to decide which is to have confidence in and which not to have confidence in. These are laid out, I believe, in the early 20s of the Principal Doctrines is one of the locations where it's discussed as much as anywhere else, and also in Lucretius, and also in the letter to Herodotus. We've also been over a good discussion of some of those principles as well. But to get back to exactly what your challenge was, Joshua, that person who says that Epicurus is not answering any of his questions is just flat wrong, because Epicurus is very clear that there is no life after death. He's not cutting any corners. He's not hedging on those things like that. He's very clear. There is not a supernatural realm outside the universe in which meddling gods control our lives. He's very clear. There is no fate in which human beings are preordained to a particular result from the moment they're born. He's very clear about some of the most important basic issues of life, and that is about as different from a radical skeptic like Pyrrho as you can possibly be. So that's one method of attacking that. Let's get some other.
I think that was a very good answer. And of course, Pyrrhonism is not the only problem. You mentioned the other problem, which was confecting things out of nothing, essentially. Then you've got problems like hard determinism, problems like motion is impossible. So Epicurus is surrounded by this sort of whirlpool of bad ideas, but he carves out a niche for himself and isn't afraid to stick to his guns on this. If he doesn't know the answer, he's not going to give you an answer. If he thinks he knows the answer, he'll give you an idea of what he thinks is the answer. But what he won't do is indulge in frank absurdities, and should be admired for that, in my view.
I got one more thing to add to that before we see if Martin has more. One comment I've heard a number of times recently is along the lines of what you just said, Joshua. Even if they back off and say, well, okay, I understand he's telling me things about the gods and the nature of the universe, so I understand he's not a radical skeptic. But listen, Epicurus is supposed to be the great philosopher of pleasure. Where is Epicurus's list of the pleasures that I'm supposed to pursue in my life? Why doesn't Epicurus tell me what to do from the minute I get up in the morning to the moment I go to bed at night in order to maximize the pleasures of my life and minimize the pains? Can't he tell me something about which pleasures I should choose and which pains I should avoid? I understand you've got some general guidelines you're going to tell me about, but why can't he tell me what to do? I hear that a significant number of times. The Stoics are happy to give me all these techniques about how I should become detached from reality and not worry if my wife and child get killed, and how my life is really just a flicker of the divine flame in the universe, and how it's my goal to sort of subsume my own personality into this great divine amoeba of jelly that's out there that is going to burn for eternity, and I should be just happy to be a part of that. The Stoics are happy to give me these specific ways to sort of psychologically train my mind to rise above pain and to get to the point where I don't need pleasure anymore. The Stoics tell me all these things. Why doesn't Epicurus tell me that? Joshua, you want to start with that one?
I think that was another very good addition, and that's something we see time and again, isn't it, on the forum, is I think I remember at one point there's a section on the forum that says something like Epicurean daily activity, something like that, and somebody joined as a member, and they said, the reason I joined the forum is because of this section, and there's nothing in it. And I thought, that's maybe there's a point to be made there. I don't know, but I certainly agree with most of what you said, and maybe it is time to bring Martin into this.
Well, let me suggest a response to start with, and you guys can elaborate on it. But the first thing that comes to my mind there is that it's just like we talked about a minute ago on knowledge. He does give us a significant amount of information and guidelines about what to do in terms of the necessary and unnecessary desires. There are different discussions of types of pleasure, that he knows the good because of certain types of pleasure. There are references to pleasures that are more of motion versus of rest. And there are particular advices that are given to particular people about the specific dangers of certain hazardous activities like romantic love or things that you can get intoxicated about. There are a lot of general guidelines about a lot of things that Epicurus talks about. But again, he's a philosopher, and he's wanting to give you the basics from which you can analyze your own circumstances. Because again, in a universe where there's no God and there's no sinner and there's no absolute right and wrong, there's not going to be an absolute list of activities that every person should engage in regardless of their circumstances. The circumstances are so incredibly significant that you can come up with innumerable examples of people who like ice cream. It's perfectly good for them to eat ice cream for some period of time. If they start eating too much of it, it becomes a pain to them. It could even kill them, I guess, if they ate nothing but ice cream continuously. Everybody's circumstances are different. Everybody's preferences and tolerances of pain and pleasure, the types of pleasure that they pursue, are different according to their personalities and their circumstances. While Epicurus does not present a list himself of specific activities in life that you should concentrate on to the exclusion of others, we all as individuals are very opinionated as to which pleasures and pains we find most significant to us. I certainly know who my friends are, who my enemies are, what types of food I like to eat, what types of activities I like. I have no problem whatsoever distinguishing among different types of pleasures that I might choose to desire or choose to engage in. And Epicurus would have been the same way. Every individual can distinguish their own preferences in life, but it's just the nature of a universe in which there is no central organizing function of a supernatural God or an ideal fate, that everybody's mechanisms don't operate in the same way. Because we have these differences of preferences and differences of the way our feelings work in pleasure and pain and all the different subtleties that you can go into it, you're not in touch with some central computer out of a Star Trek episode, or you're not in touch with some central blob of divine fire like a Stoic might suggest to you, or you're not in touch with the supernatural God, as many religions would suggest to you, that will validate your choices for you and say, well and truly done, my faithful servant. I think that's a butchering of a Bible verse. There is no ultimate right or wrong, ultimate reward after you die for the way you've conducted yourself. So only you can evaluate how successfully you have lived your life. That would be the way I would start with that kind of analysis. I mean, there's all sorts of different directions you can go into it, because Epicurus does give a lot of practical advice in different fragments that are maintained. This is where we really miss a lot of the details, I think, from the books that are lost, is that almost certainly he would have gone into many more examples of different things. But really, in the end, all the examples add up to the same thing. It's pleasure and pain that nature gave us to guide our lives with. And we see the results of the actions that we take in the pleasure and pain that comes to us as a result of those actions. Nobody else experiences life exactly like we do ourselves. Nobody registers that pain and pleasure except us. And so ultimately, we ourselves are the judge of whether we've spent our lives intelligently. That's one way I'd attack it. Joshua, what do you think? And while Martin's still thinking.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a whole lot more to say, because I'm interested in this idea that, we're talking about the condensation of the air and all that with the atmosphere and all this going on. And I was interested to trace this idea of the pneuma or the pneuma, which would be I think I have a quote here from, this is from Marcus Aurelius. He says, "Whatever this is that I am, it is flesh and a little spirit and an intelligence." And he goes on to say that, "Consider what the spirit is, air, and never the same air, but vomited out and gulped in again every instant." And so this, I think, was a fairly common thought among the ancient Greeks, that there's this long-standing, interesting sort of anthropological issue that where do people think that they are? Do you think that you're behind your eyes, or do you think that you're in your breast? For a long time, people thought that the heart was like the seat of the soul. And then you've got this idea that the pneuma, or the breath that you breathe out and breathe in again, is the soul. And then eventually when you die, you give up the ghost, as I think it says in the Bible. And so I think this has to influence the way people think about things like meteorology and the movement of clouds and the condensation of the atmosphere and that kind of thing. Because if you believe that your spirit is basically a kind of air, I'm probably totally butchering this concept, but it just seemed to me that maybe there was something there worth talking about.
Well, I remember in Lucretius, he talks about air being an example, different animals having different personalities, that some of them have maybe more mixed with heated air or heat, or just the different ways that their spirits are composed is sort of a reflection that gives rise to their personalities and so forth. So I do think you're right that observations of the air and so forth were related by these guys to all sorts of things about human life.
Yeah, and the way they thought about it. And like I say, that's I quoted Marcus Aurelius there, but that's a fairly, I don't know if I want to use the word universal, but that's a very common understanding of how things work in the ancient world, particularly in ancient Greece.
That's what everybody observes when you die. One of the first things that you can see is they've stopped breathing.
Yeah.
They've stopped bringing in the air and putting it out again. Well, why don't we go on to the remainder of what we've been discussing for today. 104 talks about thunderbolts and that superstition must be excluded. And then he goes on and talks about cyclones, which is always kind of an interesting phenomenon, whether it's dirt devils or tornadoes or whatever. They're very striking formations of wind forming into circular motion, as he says. And whirlwinds are produced in all the various ways in which their creation may occur owing to the movement of the wind, but if it reaches the sea, it produces water spouts. And that's where we left off the reading for today, but it continues on next week, which is what we'll do as we come back next week to talk about a few more of these examples. We had a long episode last week. Maybe we can balance that with a little bit shorter one this week. Anybody have additional thoughts? Martin, we need to get something from you this week on weather. How's the weather in Cologne, Germany?
Hot and sunny. It's great.
The weather is hugely influential over the way people will live their lives. I guess the classic example is the Mediterranean climate. People like to sort of caricature Mediterranean people, or Greeks even, as just like basically spending their time dancing on the beaches or whatever. Like,
is it Alexis Sauber's movie or?
Zorba the Greek. I don't know what Zorba the Greek's even about, but I have this picture that he's constantly dancing, not necessarily on a beach though. Do you know what Zorba the Greek is about, Joshua?
No idea. Never even heard of it.
Martin, help us. What is Zorba the Greek about?
Yeah, this is Zorba himself is a Greek, and he becomes the assistant of I don't know the actual connection anymore, but I think that guy inherited something on Greece, no? And wanted to invest into something, build something there, and it collapsed, no? And so I still remember this final scene when Zorba is actually dancing on the beach because the British guy who just got ruined by the failing of the project wants to learn how to dance, no? This Greek dance. No?
Yeah, that's kind of validating what I'm remembering. It's kind of a caricature of the Greeks as being ultimately happy people who dance a lot or something like that. That's a gross oversimplification of the meaning of it. I see it was a 1964 movie with Anthony Quinn, and I see a movie poster that has basically somebody dancing, and it appears to be either on an island or on a beach. And why are we talking about that? Just because the weather of the Greek good question. Why are we talking about that? Just because the weather of Greece is probably a significant aspect of the way they put their culture together. Obviously, people talk about how they're in the middle of the trade with ships and so forth, and climate has lots of influences over.
It also has quite a lot of influence, Cassius, over the reason we still have some of these texts, the reason some of them were lost, and it certainly has a huge influence on, because you got to get it copied. I guess I can sort of segue into this. I was recently in Tennessee, and we went to the Jack Daniel's distillery, which was interesting. I don't particularly like Jack Daniel's, but it was very good to go to the distillery and see how it was made, and particularly to see the influence of these charred oak casks that they use to mellow the whiskey in. What they'll tell you when you're there, something I didn't know, is that when I guess it's not whiskey at that point, but when it comes out of the distillery, it is this clear liquid. There's no color to it, and then they put it in these barrels and they store it in these barrel houses in the Tennessee countryside for a number of years, and then the reason the whiskey gets all of its color and quite a lot of its flavor is because of the influence of the atmosphere. As in summer, the wood expands and it draws the whiskey into the wood. And then in the winter, the wood contracts and it pushes the whiskey back out again. And so when you have several years of that action going on, it's the whiskey going in and out of the wood that actually gives it so much of what we think of as its characteristic, which I was just fascinated by.
I did not realize that.
But it's the same kind of thing. If you're trying to preserve ancient texts, it's the changes, it's not so much humidity that ruins texts, I don't think, or temperature. It's the changes, the cyclical changes of temperature and humidity and pressure and all that really cause problems for these old books, because as the fibers that make up the books contract and expand, they sort of break down on a very microscopic level over time, and it just totally weakens the text, and then it just crumbles apart essentially. And then there's the most interesting and obvious example, which is the texts at Herculaneum, the papyri that were preserved by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. So there's, weather it just influences so much of how we approach our day and how we think about the world that we live in. And nevertheless, it's quite difficult to talk about for an hour and a half, I find. Epicurus certainly would have availed himself of better data and better knowledge and better equipment if he had access to it. He just didn't have access to it.
Let me try to bring us to a close by making this comment. You both have made statements to the effect of how fascinating you find this investigation into science, and how it would be absurd to suggest that we've gone far enough and we don't need to continue. The point of distinction I would raise is, and I share that completely with the two of you, the point of distinction is that apparently there are certain types of people in this world who just don't see things that way. And we're not going to try to break it all down and where those people come from, but only to observe that Just like people have differences in pleasures and pains, they have differences of viewpoint on the importance of science and the importance of understanding things. I cannot identify with those people who feel like it's okay just to take something on authority and not worry about it and not try to understand it yourself, whether it's a personality trait or just something else that comes from your particular circumstances. The type of people who are generally, in my observation, attracted to Epicurus are what you're talking about, the people who find information pleasant in itself to understand and who understand the uses that you can put to it. And I was trying to think of a humorous way to do this. I'm not sure I can be humorous about it, but just think about the distinction between the writings of Epicurus and his investigatings into science, as opposed to the writings of the church fathers or the Bible. What section of the Bible would you go to discuss the formation of clouds and get an understanding of how snow or ice or tornadoes and those things might work? It's just a totally different mindset of a religious personality. For some reason, there's one particular question in the New Testament that comes to my mind. As an example, there's something about with the disciples were talking with Jesus about somebody who was blind. And I remember there's this question that they asked Jesus, who sinned, Jesus, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And there's this mentality of looking to good and evil, to sin as the source of the things that are important in life and what makes things go in the direction they go. And those people, they aren't going to look for the medical reasons to understand whether genetically or through disease or through some other natural process this person was born blind. The distinction between the viewpoint is about as different as that phrase about what has Rome to do with Jerusalem, or what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem. I always forget which one is the right example. Maybe both were used at different times. But the approach that Epicurus took is so different from this supernatural religion mindset, still holds sway over much of the world. So all of this is very important even today. Joshua, is that a good place to close?
I think that's probably a good place to close.
Okay, probably as it will go on. We'll be in the same situation next week of having just basically particular facts to talk about. So maybe we can expand on that next week as well. So with that, let's bring the episode to a close and we'll come back next week. So thanks for your time today and we'll see you again soon.
Very good.
Okay, bye.
Bye.